Hymn number 50, Burdens Are Lifted at Calvary. Days are filled with sorrow and care, hearts are lonely and drear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Cast your care on Jesus today, leave your weary and fear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Troubled soul, the Savior can see every burden and tear. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Calvary, Calvary. Burdens are lifted at Calvary, Jesus is very near. Dennis, would you open us with a word of prayer?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you granted to us. Thank you, Father, for the health that we have. Thank you for being able to meet this evening to study a portion of your word. Thankful for our brothers and sisters in Christ that live here and we worship together, Father. We pray blessings upon us. We pray for the spreading of the gospel in this community, this county, through the state and nation throughout the world. Thank you, Father, for your written word and for your having penned and for your care over it through the centuries that we have it today to read and study. We pray that you bless each of us with open and receptive minds. Help us with our memories. Give us wisdom, Father, in the application of the truths. We pray that you would be with Mike as he leads the class. Help us, Father, to always be about following and obeying your word. We thank you, Father, for Jesus and his death at Calvary. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So we're in Genesis chapter 34. I don't have any handouts tonight, so whatever virus that Austin has on his printer, it's transferred to mine, so no. Yeah. Genesis 34. So what we find here in this particular chapter is an account of two contrasting generations. Hamor and Jacob, the heads of the tribes, having experienced much in their lifetime, have become more peace-loving, more conciliatory. But their sons, Shechem, Simeon, Levi, not so much. Their character is more impetuous, not considering the consequences of their actions. Shechem's lovesickness tempting him to take Dinah against her will. And then realizing his sin only after her being inconsolable. Now it's up to the two tribal chiefs to work things out to help cover up this sin. kind of like David and Bathsheba. But the impetuousness of Simeon and Levi find them refusing to accept any reconciliation except by deceit. Could they have learned this deceit could be used by their mother Leah's example, as she had deceived her and her father, or her brother deceived Jacob? It's quite certain that the Canaanite pagans were more honorable than Simeon and Levi. Why Jacob was not more distraught about this calamity against his daughter Dinah, we're not told. Perhaps because she's the daughter of Leah, which he didn't love as much as Rachel. It seems that he's too laid back, caring more about what the Canaanites thought than the fact that God would have been with him had he chosen to trust in Jehovah. Instead, he fears the Canaanites, that they could wipe out his family for what his sons have done. Rather than trusting in God to protect him. I mean, after all, he's part of God's eternal plan, right? God's not going to allow anything to happen to him if possible. But in verse 15, it says, only on this condition. Now, Simeon and Levi had heard what Hamor and Shechem offered. But they come back and say, okay, sounds good, but there's this condition. If you will be as we are, every male of you be circumcised. Then when we give you our daughters unto you, and we will take your daughters to us, we will dwell with you, we will become one people. But if you will not hearken to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and we will be gone. And their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son, and the young man deferred not to do the thing, because he had delight in Jacob's daughter. And he was honored above all the house of his father. And Hamor and Shechem, his son, came unto the gate of their city, communed with the men of their city, saying, these men are peaceable with us. Therefore, let them dwell in the land, trade therein, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters to us for wives. Let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent unto us to dwell with us, to become one people, if every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Shall not their cattle and their substance and all their beasts be ours? Only let us consent unto them, and they will dwell with us. And unto Hamor and unto Shechem his son hearkened all that went out of the gate of his city. Every male was circumcised, all that went out of the gate of his city. And it came to pass on the third day, when they were sore, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword, came upon the city unawares, and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went forth. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds, their donkeys, and that which was in the city, that which was in the field, all their wealth, all their little ones and their wives, took they captive and made a prey, even all that was in the house. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me. You make me stink to the inhabitants of the city, of the land. Among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and I being few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and smite me. And I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they said, should he deal with our sister as with a harlot? choosing to make a pretense of religion through the act of circumcision. Simeon and Levi, in their vicious hypocrisy, was nothing more than a cloak to cover their true intent, to return evil for evil, basically. Something that Jesus talked about later in Romans 12 and verse 17. Simeon and Levi laid out their plan that the Israelites would only agree to Hamer and Shechem's offer as long as all the males of the city were circumcised like the males of Israel. Now keep in mind that when Scripture refers to Jacob as Jacob, his name has been changed to Israel here. It represents his former character before he became Israel. When it mentions Israel, that's in the spiritual sense of his name. One who trusts and serves Jehovah. So here, calling him Jacob, he's still thinking like a worldly person. He's not thinking about one who serves God. The fact that the two sons refuse to accept the offer of Hamer was good in the sight of God, of Jehovah. God would not approve of mixing peoples, of mixing heathen with his chosen people by swapping daughters in marriage. But the sin was in the way in which they advanced a supposed alliance. What did Jacob's sons, what right did they have to propose God's sign of a covenant to heathens? None, right? What right did they have to use it to ratify a human agreement? None. What right did they have to employ this divine sign of God as a mask for their treachery? None whatsoever. No authority at all. So it's apparent that Hamer and Jacob had been on friendly terms for some time, since Jacob bought land from Hamer. So he's not viewing this plan of Simeon and Levi as anything but honest and sincere. Shechem's dad. He's more focused on the material advantages of the alliance than anything else. Jacob was a wealthy man. So the Hivites could benefit greatly by adding them to their community. It's just like Abraham when he was with the Philistines. As long as he was with them, they became wealthy. God blessed them as well, allowing Abraham to live in their land unmolested. So they're thinking the same thing here. Most likely they were familiar with circumcision, not necessarily as a religious aspect, but simply a social one, aware of its sanitary value. The Hivites most likely were not of the Canaanite race, not being circumcised, because Canaanites and the rest of Canaan were circumcised. But just this one group was not. It was not only the Hebrews that circumcised, the Egyptians did, the Phoenicians did, and the Canaanites circumcised as well, while the Greeks, the Romans, the Philistines did not. Although other nations chose to use circumcision, it was not for the same reason as the Hebrews. We know the reason for the Hebrews, right? Theirs was a sign of God, that there was a covenant between them and Jehovah. Genesis 17, verse 10. So the words of Jacob's sons pleased Hamor and Shechem. In verse 9 it says, the young man, talking about Shechem, deferred not to do the thing. What does that mean? Deferred not. Decided not to be circumcised? He may have changed his mind later. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Hebrew word there makes it literally say, the young man delayed not to do the thing. He didn't delay. He was immediately circumcised. He didn't wait to go to the men of the city and see what they thought about it. He went ahead and had it done. Because it goes ahead in that verse and says, because he loved Dinah. In verse 20, as usual in any town among the ancient peoples, the city gate was the place where men of the city met to discuss and make decisions concerning the welfare of the city. Both Hamor and Shechem arrive at the city gate, and they spoke to the men that were gathered there. They set forth several arguments to gain the approval of the city to take part in this proposal. Argument number 1. Jacob and his sons have been peaceable with us in the time that they've been here, since they purchased land and set up tent. Therefore, why should we not allow them to continue to dwell in the land, to trade with us and with others as we do? They can be just like us. After all, the land is large enough, isn't it, for all of us? It's large enough to allow them to wander wherever they choose with their flocks and their herds. Argument number 2. Should we all agree to do this thing, we will allow them to take our daughters to be wives, and they will allow us to take their daughters to be wives. But there's one condition. Notice how he starts it off before he gets to the big thing here, the big condition. They will only agree to this proposal if every male among us is circumcised like they are. Argument number 3. With such an alliance, their material wealth will become our material wealth, as we'll all be one community of people. So hearing what Hamor and Shechem had to say, all the men of the city agreed with the proposal of Jacob's sons. Now, was it blind faith in their leader that caused them to just go ahead and agree? If there wasn't any dissenting votes, or well, it seems that it was common among the ancients that the chief could elicit obedience of anyone merely because he was the chief. People would obey without question whatever he said. If he ordered them to take their lives, they would do it without question. So very possibly that's what we have here. Is he's the chief, he's telling us, well, we need to go along with him, whatever he thinks. But then we also have Shechem. He didn't delay in being circumcised. So he might have been an example too. I've already done it. Oh, okay. So the chief is trying to convince us that we ought to do this, and his son has already done it? Well, that's good enough for me. But I think what really drove the nail in their coffins was their covetousness. The wealth of the Hebrews that would be brought into the community, that they could all benefit from. Which is really no different today, is it? Covetousness. You know, we find local, county, state, federal governments doing things not for the sake of the people that they represent, but for the sake of more money. Politicians starting out with the same income of the people they're wanting their votes from, but when they retire, they're millionaires. Yeah, Chris? Oh, you raised your hand. Yeah, Dennis?
Seems like this account emphasizes the importance of having wise leaders. That is to say, someone who looks at the current circumstances and then projects where will that lead. A wise leader would seem like, if they wanted to agree with this, would say, wait, we will be defenseless if we do this.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll do half will remain with their weaponry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's Monday morning quarterback.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it seems like someone would have said, look, Chief, you thought this through.
Yeah.
What kind of position are you putting us in?
And maybe they weren't that familiar with it. I mean, they kind of knew what it was, but they weren't familiar about the consequences of doing it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you would think somebody would say something. But like I say, if it's, you just listen to what the chief says and you agree, you don't disagree. You don't question anything he has to say. I was reading this thing about this one general that had 40,000 men. He had gone through Arabia, taking city after city. He had, what did I say, 70,000 men? Huh? 40,000 men. And he came to this one city, and the chief of the city came out and said, you don't have enough men to fight against us. And the general said, but are your men like my men? And he said, what do you mean? They called 3 of his men, told one to take his life, and he immediately cut himself open and died. told the other man to jump off the tower of the city, and he jumped off. And then he told another man to drown himself, and he did, without question. And the city surrendered to him, because they didn't have the same people with that kind of dedication. So the Hivites, they could only see dollar signs with such a proposal. But Simeon and Levi could only see enemies and the spoils that they would get by taking them on. Verse 25, we're told, on the third day, when they were sore. When adult circumcision is at its height of inflammation, before the true healing process begins. It's what they waited for. Simeon and Levi already knew the process. They knew all we got to do is just wait for 3 days, and day 3, that's the perfect time to attack. Question. Not knowing how large the city was, how many men were there? Oh, we don't know, because we don't know how big the city was, do we? We have no idea how many there were that they had to deal with. Was it only Simeon and Levi who took the city on? Or do they represent all the sons of Jacob taking part in the raid? Since they were the, huh?
Verse 7 seems to indicate at least a portion of the sons of Levi. It's not in chronological order. If it is, they came after the original slaughter and picking up.
Yeah, a lot of scholars are divided on that Simeon and Levi represent all the sons, plus the servants of Jacob that would have taken part in it, in the whole thing. And then others say, like saying it was just Simeon and Levi who slaughtered everyone. And then the other sons came in and mopped up, taking all the spoils. So, but yeah, verse 27 seems to imply that, doesn't it? Sons of Levi came upon the slain. Well, all the men that had been slaughtered and spoiled the city. Now, there's no doubt that God's justice has been brought down on these people. Why? Why would God be involved in this? Why would he approve of it? Well, it was the Hittites that lived in Shechem that brought folly against Israel with the defiling of Dinah. They not only brought folly against Israel, but against Jehovah by that. Because one of his chosen people was defiled. And so the entire city was guilty of what Shechem did. How could that be? How could everyone be guilty of what Shechem did? Yeah, everybody was silent. Nobody said anything. Nobody came to her aid. Yeah. It's just like, I don't know, I can't think of his name. That was AI. They were supposed to go in and utterly destroy everything and not take anything. And the one man took some silver and buried it under his tent. And all of Israel was guilty for what that man did. Achan. Thank you. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So in a way, you could say the men in Shechem were Achan too. But they also agreed to the terms of Simeon and Levi by agreeing to being circumcised as a means to enrich themselves. Something that Simeon and Levi had no authority to offer it. They had no authority to accept it, to take part in it. And while Simeon and Levi used it to entrap them and wipe them out, they would pay for their part in the sin as well. The entire event is completely against the will of God, yet he can still use it to punish the Hivites and later punish Simeon and Levi. You know, many times we wonder about certain events that we read about, how God can turn a blind eye to hypocrisy and deceit and so forth, used by his own people. But it's not that he ignores it, but he allows it to complete its end. Because he's already seen the end. He knows what happens. So his justice kicks in when it needs to and punishes the crime. After slaying all the males, they plundered the town, took away all the women and children as slaves, as well as their livestock, adding it to their own. And they even took everything out of all the houses of the city. Did I leave anything out that they did? Huh? Yeah, in the fields, yeah. They rescued their sister. Rescued Dinah. Yeah. Verse 30, upon leaving the city behind and traveling back to their land with all the spoils, Jacob discovers what has been done, or perhaps he knew all along what had happened. But he's now able to vent his disapproval to his sons. Jacob, being a spiritual man, he has become over the last 30 years or so, was deeply troubled. He tells them, I'm deeply troubled over this. Why? Yeah, he's afraid all the Canaanites are going to learn about it and they're going to come after him and destroy him. So, we're few in number compared to everyone else, all these other countries. But I think, God can do anything if you put trust in him. Was it Gideon had 300 men, wiped out 120,000? So he's worried. He's not trusting in God. He's worried that the Canaanites are going to come and destroy him. Which we will see in the next chapter, that he convinces his family they need to leave the region for a while. But the land of Shechem is said to be a summit of Gerizim, Judges 9, verse 6, along the Ephraim range of mountains. Shechem is the first place that Abraham came to upon entering Canaan and stopped there for a while. Joseph, at the age of 17, sought his brothers at Shechem out in a pasture near Shechem, Genesis 37, verse 12 and following. According to clay tablets found in the area in the 1800s, Shechem fell into the hands of the Hebrews in the 15th century BC, which would have been during the days of Joshua. As the Israelites made their conquest of the Promised Land, Joshua called for a renewal of the covenant of God at Shechem, Joshua chapter 8. When the land was divided up among the tribes, Shechem fell to Ephraim, Joshua 20 and verse 7. But then it was assigned to the Kohathite Levites as a city of refuge, Joshua 21. At Shechem, Joshua gathered the people together for his last speech before he died, Joshua 24. Shechem had become a Canaanite city once again after the Israelites left Canaan and went down into Egypt during the famine. You know, they were gone for 215 years. After the death of Gideon, his illegitimate son, Abimelech, by a Shechemite woman, persuaded men of the city to make him king. Judges 9 and verse 6. And it's at Shechem that Solomon's son Rehoboam was inaugurated king over Israel. 1 Kings chapter 12. Also, the 10 tribes at Shechem chose to follow Jeroboam instead of the house of David. And Jeroboam made Shechem the capital of his city, of the northern 10 tribes of that kingdom. So there's a lot of history with the city of Shechem. So 2 weeks. Yeah, next week's singing, isn't it? So 2 weeks we'll start chapter 35. And hopefully my computer will be working better.
we've heard of some of the prayer requests. We pray for Marvin and Teresa and Naomi. We continue to pray for their health and that they will be able to get back on their feet. Father, we pray for Jason's wife, and we just pray that things go well with the removal of the stone, and we just pray that, we'll just pray for that it will all go well. Father, there's others out there who has various things. We want to pray for Vicky. We pray that Vicky too will also get back on her feet. We just ask that you be with her, Steve. Father, we ask that you be with us as we go through the remainder of this week and until we meet again on the appointed time on the first day of the week. It's in Jesus' name I pray.
Amen. I apologize for not having the sound on.